Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and on The Detail today, assets, compound interest, credit scores, liabilities, investment and taxes. Just a few financial literacy terms, and I don't recall learning about any of them in school. And I'm not alone.
I think I learned my financial literacy the same way that most parents have, and that is just through trial and error, which is not the ideal way to go because trial and error tends to include error, and errors can be costly.
But that's all about to change.
Budgeting and understanding taxes and interest rates are some of the financial skills school students will learn as part of the curriculum from next year.
We will be including financial education right from years 1 all the way through to year 10.
Making financial literacy compulsory in schools from 2027, why it is so important and how it will shape our children's and our country's economic future. And can our current teachers cope with the extra class lessons?
That's a very real concern.
That's Neil Edmund, CEO of Moneytime, an online financial literacy program for students aged 10 to 14 in New Zealand and overseas. He reckons most Kiwi kids don't know much, if anything, about the basics of money management. Case in point, he once mocked up some financial literacy programs and took them to local schools in Christchurch.
And I was really surprised to learn that most students did not know what interest is. None of the students I talked to, I did 131 one-on-one interviews with students going through this process. Not one of them could tell me confidently what investing was. And so what I realised is that most students at school, or certainly at age 10 to 12, are starting at a level of just about zero knowledge around money management. And I had to go back and rewrite the early part of my program. It had taken me 3 months of writing to get to that point. I had to go back and rewrite all of that because I'd assumed that they would know more.
That mirrors his own school experience. He knew nothing either, but he wishes it was different and he had been taught about financial education in the classroom.
Well, I think a lot of us have learnt what we know by learning the hard way. We've lost money needlessly, or we haven't made money when we could have. And I think we all recognise that we could possibly be better off financially if we'd made better decisions. And we would have made better decisions if we'd known what the answers were. And that answers come from being educated.
And that brings me to the government has obviously just announced that financial literacy will become compulsory for year 1 to 10 students. Just your response then to that?
Oh, I think that's fantastic. What I'm particularly pleased to see is that they're going to be starting it right from year 1. And I think we all appreciate how important it is to develop any sort of good habit or behaviour. The earlier you can start it, the more likely it is to become entrenched and continue. And so I actually think that we're going to be leading the world if we are implementing it from year 1. I think that's terrific. So years 1 to 10, that's 10 years of financial education. Just imagine how much better people are going to be around their decision making with money with that sort of education. I just think it's terrific. I totally, absolutely applaud the government for this.
Forgive me though, year 1, you're 5 years old, you're barely learning your ABCs and your 1 + 1 = 2. What do you get taught at that age about financial literacy?
Well, I think we're about to find out when the government produces their curriculum for social sciences. You make a good point, that is very early. And so I think that at that stage, you just make it very basic. What is money? What can money buy you? Do you have to spend all the money that you've got, or could you put some aside and have more to spend in the future? You'd have to keep it very basic. But then as you go up through the ages, by the time they get to age 10 to 12, they can understand reasonably complex financial concepts. Well, not, I want to say reasonably, things like compound interest. We find in the Moneytime program that if we find the right way to explain it to them, they can understand that sort of thing. And things like return on investment, if you put it to them in a clear way using simple language, they'll understand the concepts. And if they can understand them at that age, then they have the confidence to start applying them when they get older and when they leave school.
Do you think it sort of can address long-term issues like debt, poverty, or poor sort of saving habits with our students?
Well, you'd like to think so. I think there's two important factors at play here. One is the education, so being taught the concepts and they're given an understanding of how money works, but then that needs to translate into behaviour for it to become effective. And there's a lot of research out there that actually questions, is there a direct link between the education and the behaviour? And the reports that I've read are mixed in the results. And so I think that you'd probably need to do a longitudinal study on that to determine just how effective good financial education is in creating good behavioural outcomes and good financial outcomes for people as they go through life. I know that the financial education department at Massey University is currently in the middle of a 20-year longitudinal study on just this topic. So it's going to be really interesting to see what they find out. I think they're somewhere around 10, 12 years into the study. And so in 8 or so years' time, we'll get to know just how much of an impact financial education really does have.
Making financial education compulsory in schools was a pre-election commitment by National. And while some schools already provide it, Education Minister Erica Stanford says it's not consistent across all schools.
84% of Kiwis say that they've never had any formal financial literacy education. We want to set our kids up for success by teaching really good money habits and practical life skills. So today we've announced that financial education will be explicitly included in the new knowledge-rich curriculum, meaning this really important learning will be experienced by all New Zealand children in primary, intermediate and secondary schools.
The Retirement Commission has been working with the Education Ministry on the new curriculum and resources to support it. And while Neil Edmund is a big champion of it, he does have concerns about our teachers, who are already juggling a full workload.
Teachers under a lot of pressure. There's been some fairly significant changes in the curriculum. There are ongoing changes at the moment. A lot of schools and teachers are dealing with high levels of truancy. There are children with behavioural issues. There's shortages of staff, shortages of teaching staff, which means extra workload for teachers. And so here's the government saying to teachers, we want you to teach a subject that hasn't really been properly taught before, or certainly not properly covered in the curriculum, and they're saying we want you to do this now going forward. I think that the government needs to provide training for teachers, professional development, because let's face it, teachers are the same as you and I. We weren't taught financial literacy, and so they're not going to necessarily have the knowledge and the confidence to do the teaching. And so I think that the government is required or needs to deliver some professional development for teachers.
Neil, do you think financial literacy, should it be a standalone subject, or can you see it sort of being integrated across other subjects?
That is a great question, Amanda, and I've given a lot of thought to that. Initially, I thought that it should be a standalone subject, and there's a lot of pros for that, a lot of advantages for that, because that would make it a serious subject that people really need to put some focus into. However, financial literacy is a life skill, and there are a lot of life skills that students would benefit from. They're things like relationships, sex education, health, nutrition, exercise, mental health. All of these things are life skills. And if you start turning them into standalone subjects and make them, if you do that, then you're going to need to put assessment around it. And if you put assessment around it, it tends to formalise things to a point where students are going to feel like, oh, it's just another subject that I have to learn. And I think the way that it's being treated at the moment, which is cross-curricular, i.e. financial education can be delivered over a number of different learning areas, I think that helps students maintain their interest and enthusiasm for it, because it's seen as something that is good to learn and enjoyable to learn, but is not a serious subject that they're going to be seriously tested on and in a pass-fail kind of manner.
Key, he says, is keeping it simple and straightforward from day one.
By the time they get to year 10, they will be able to confidently handle concepts like return on investment or compound interest, or how ACC works, or how insurance works. So it's important that they do keep it simple, and then they build on it as the kids get older and to a point that they can handle some fairly complex issues. One of the things that really excites me about the government's announcement is that they're clearly focusing on personal finance, which is quite different from economics. Economics tend to be how the money goes around the world on a macro level, country to country, employment figures, interest rates, how countries and economies work. Most kids don't really need to know that. They need to know how to manage their money. So I was just really pleased to see in the announcement that they're wanting things like needs versus wants, and how bank accounts work, and how you earn money, and what constitutes a good spending decision, and why do we pay taxes. I think all of those sorts of things are the sorts of things that kids need to know. It's not how a government runs its economy or a country's economy works. It's about how money directly affects them and how they can use it to make their lives better.
Do you think, on a personal note, perhaps you would be a wealthier man or further along your career had you had that knowledge earlier in your life?
Oh, no doubt. Absolutely no doubt. I've made some bad decisions along the way. I've invested money in things that I should not have. Obviously, hindsight's 20/20, but I certainly haven't taken advantage of opportunities that came along that I could have. Just things like buying property when I was younger. I still don't have a property other than the house that we live in, and I could have, but I didn't, because I didn't know how it worked. And my family had not done that. Well, my parents had not done that, and so I had no role models for it. None of my immediate aunts, uncles, etc., had done it either. And so it just never really occurred to me that that was something that I could do. And yet you look at a lot of people in New Zealand who now enjoy a comfortable level of living. A lot of them, that's a result of having owned property, because it's been one of the best performing investment or asset classes in the country for the last 30, 40, 50 years. If I'd had the knowledge on how to invest in property, then I would have gone ahead and done it.
Money, he says, is often a tough subject to talk about in the home.
Quite a lot of parents, why they don't talk to their children about money is because it's perceived as, or they know how serious it is. It affects everybody, and it has a major impact on people's lifestyle and their opportunities and their choices. And so it's perceived to be a pretty serious topic. So I think that it's important that the government makes sure that it's seen as a life skill alongside the other life skills I mentioned before, just the things that kids need to learn to help them function healthily and happily and effectively through their lives. And so it's useful, enjoyable information that they know they're going to benefit from. If you make that too serious, then I think that could turn kids off it.
Now, the government is investing $100 million to try and improve maths outcomes for primary school children. That includes more money for intervention teachers and every child also being tested in their first 2 years of schooling to find out if they need support.
The government is injecting $100 million into maths education over 4 years. That's part of Budget 2025. Your response to that?
Wow. Well, that's terrific for maths. If they've got that sort of money to spend, then it'd be nice if they could also allocate some budget to financial literacy. The programs that are currently provided into schools are all sponsored by companies and trusts and foundations from outside the government. And it's hard yards. It's hard going, raising sufficient funds to keep a program going, to deliver it into the schools, make sure it's regularly updated so that it's current. It costs money, and it's really hard finding external parties who will fund these programs. So if the government could provide some budget for these resources, that would be very much appreciated.
Susan Edmonds knows a thing or two about money, funding and investments. In fact, she writes about all things financial as RNZ's money correspondent. But this wasn't a skill she picked up or studied at school.
I don't think I ever did, honestly. I was trying to think about that, actually. I don't think it ever came up. And I think at the time I didn't really think that was a problem. I kind of got my little FPOS card for ASB when I got my first job when I was 15 and made some really terrible decisions from then on. And it actually, I didn't really get sort of my head around it until I was maybe in my early 20s. And that was after I'd been through that period where you go to university and the bank says, do you want an overdraft and do you want a credit card? And you go, yeah, sure. And then go, oh, that maybe wasn't the best idea. So perhaps it would have been good to have something, when I was about 15 to say, think a little bit more about some of these decisions. That might have been quite helpful.
She says making financial education compulsory in schools is a brilliant move, even for the 5-year-olds.
Well, I mean, my kids are 8 and 10, and I'd like to think they have an idea of the value of money, but I really don't think they do, because their idea is basically that if you have money, you should try and spend it as fast as possible, and probably on things like Fortnite V-Bucks and stuff. And it's just, I think it would be good to help them get some idea of, what money can do, but I think they will have to be quite careful about what they try to teach 5-year-olds, because maybe at that stage it's more about helping mum and dad think about how they do the grocery shopping or something like that. I'm not sure. I don't think you could be getting into how compound interest works when you're 5.
Yeah, that could be a big ask. What are the essential things that people should know when it comes to financial literacy?
It's really hard because a lot of the things that you think are important now might not be important in 10 years' time. Things like credit cards are probably even on their way out. So teaching people too much about that now, if they're young, might not be that helpful. But I think some of the basic things are really helpful. Things like why, if you start investing now, it can be really effective over the long term, and why you should take the opportunity when you're young to make the most of your investing time horizon, because that's such a huge asset to have, that you have that time to invest and let your returns compound over and over again. And I think if we can teach kids that, then maybe even if they're just putting away a small amount of money every week or month or whatever, then they could make quite a significant difference in their lives. And they've got the opportunities to do it now, when it was much harder when I was a teenager. You couldn't just put $10 a week into the share market because there was no way to do that. But now you can do that. And so if we can show people how effective that could be, that would be a really good lesson to learn. And then on the flip side, if you could show how interest works against them, then that would be another thing that would be really helpful, because if you can avoid that, then you've got more money working, well, you can potentially free up more money to put to work for you instead of against you. And I guess that's the basic lesson, that I think that if we can get people to get their heads around that and maybe just start a good investing habit, saving if they can, that sort of thing, then that would be really good. I don't think we want to get to the point where everyone's terrified to spend money, because money is for spending, and you do want young people to be able to have a good time and go travel and stuff like that if that's what they want to do. But it would be good if they could understand the opportunities that they have at that age, because you always see those people who are incredibly well off and they say, oh yes, I got into this investment when I was 18, or I bought this house when I was, 4 years old or something. And it's always that just having had the years and years of doing it, that's given them that advantage.
Do you worry though, because, the reality is some people, just kids, won't have money, and it could be a divisive, or this isn't relevant to me, or, what are you talking about? We don't have money for sharesies, and that it could be a tough subject for some kids?
Yes, absolutely. I do worry a lot about that, because, there are some kids who are working part-time jobs to support their whole household, not to give themselves fun spending money like I was fortunate enough to be getting. And I think that will be a really big challenge for teachers to work out how they pitch it. So it's like, you could do this if you've got $10 free a week, but maybe your whole household doesn't have $10 free a week. And how do you not make those kids feel like they're going to end up even further behind? because if you're saying to kids, look at the opportunity you've got to get ahead, but not you guys because you can't afford it, that's a pretty tricky thing to navigate. And teachers are great at this sort of thing, but hopefully there is a plan for that.
So, once we make all our kids financially literate, will we see economic benefits for the country?
Well, I actually found a paper from the Reserve Bank about this. It was quite a while ago, but it pointed out that better financial literacy could help the financial system because it would help it be more sound and efficient if people weren't making so many perhaps risky decisions, if they weren't taking out so much debt or, better types of debt. The paper says a more financially literate society could be expected to exert stronger market disciplines on financial service providers. So there could definitely be ways that it could make the economy as a whole stronger if we were all making better decisions, investing well, that sort of thing. It could be wider outcomes than you might think at first, perhaps.
Wow, that's fantastic. Is there a risk, though, that financial education oversimplifies sort of complex economic realities?
Yes, I think that is definitely true. But that's probably true of a lot of things that you study in school and in uni. But I think there's a risk that you could ignore all the cultural stuff that comes with money. It's easy, to put our own judgments on it and not think about how other people might be approaching it. I know when I was early 20s, I had a boyfriend who was Samoan, and we had no money ever. But his thing was that when his family needed money, he would give his money to them. And it used to drive me nuts. But now I can see that it's just a different approach. And you can't come into this kind of thing with, quite a Eurocentric, this is what you should do with money, you should save 50%, whatever. If that doesn't work with somebody's cultural expectations, I think we've got to be quite careful in how we structure that.
Susan, are there any examples of school-based financial education that have made a measurable difference?
Well, apparently Denmark has a program for teenagers, and that's been credited with the country's 71% financial literacy rate, which is apparently really high by international standards. But while I was looking around for research on this, I noticed that a lot of papers talk about how difficult it is to get right and how you strike the right balance and that sort of thing. So there will be a few things to work through, I think.
But if they do get it right, Neil Edmonds says the Education Ministry could be in for an A-grade mark.
New Zealand has an opportunity here to become a world leader in financial education. We currently perform reasonably well in terms of financial literacy tests, I suppose, internationally accepted tests. However, we're not great. But I think introducing financial education to kids at year 1 in school and taking it through to year 10, making sure that our teachers have some professional development around it, making sure there's good quality resources provided to assist the teachers with the teaching, and making sure that there's some level of assessment to indicate whether or not the resources that are being used are effective, then I see no reason why we can't become a world leader in financial literacy.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Neil Edmond and Susan Edmonds. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Phil Benj. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.